I'm Mary Massey here with co-host John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audience listening to the live broadcast here in Northern California, and to our many fans of the show and of the station listening to the live stream throughout the country and throughout the world, including some listeners on the Al Jazeera network.
Right. This program can be heard again at the KMUD archives, our Heroes and Patriots Facebook and YouTube pages, and our program website, heroespatriots.org. Views and opinions expressed today by our speaker are not necessarily those of the board, staff, underwriters, volunteers, or members of KMUD. Equal opportunities for differing opinions will be made available. John and I welcome back to the program Arun Gupta. Mr. Gupta is an investigative reporter, and we are talking about two topics today that he has been involved in. One is the ongoing campus protests throughout the United States, but also around the world. And secondly, the article that he recently reported that highlights the possible war crimes, in particular sexual rapes between Hamas and Israel in the conflict. So, Mr. Gupta, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on today.
It's so nice to have you back with us, and it's been a difficult scheduling you, but I know you've been very busy covering the protests. I wanted to talk about a general question, first of all, and that is the media coverage. You know, as a reporter, you have been, you covered the Occupy Wall Street protests. You're now covering the campus protests. Could you talk about briefly how you feel the media is addressing the issues both here and then the coverage with respect to war crimes in the Middle East?
Let me say, almost universally an atrocious job. There are some good exceptions on the first topic. And, let's be clear, I'm talking about the corporate media here, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, various bureaus. The harsh reality is there's not a lot of media actually left. But when it comes to covering the student protest, I've been up at I've been at all the student camps in New York City, starting downtown New York University, the New School, Fashion Institute of Technology. I was up at Columbia inside the camp for 3 days, and then at City College of New York. And those latter two camps were violently crushed on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning by this massive deployment of the police. I think it's the New York Times that really needs to be singled out in a lot of ways in terms of what they're doing, how they're reporting things. There's this narrative about the student protests that university administrators are trying to balance First Amendment freedoms with with safety for Jewish students.
Right.
And this is just a complete lie. Especially what we saw at UCLA in the last few days. Basically, these Zionist gangs who apparently were funded by Jessica and Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian, and Bill Ackman, this extremist billionaire, rampage and attacked the student protester camp for hours while the police, public safety, and the police stood by and did nothing. And that's really what the narrative is that the universities, government officials have weaponized anti-Semitism and Jewish safety to use it as cover to attack the student camps and student protesters who are peacefully protesting genocide. Now, is every single person, every single student an angel? No, of course not. Have maybe some inflammatory things been said? It appears that way, but part of the problem is that you have all these provocateurs, again, often Zionists. In the case of Northeastern University in Boston last week, there was a large student protest being held, and some Zionist provocateurs showed up, and one of them yelled, "Kill the Jews!" And there's audio of this. There's video, but you can't see the person. But people identified it as one of the Zionists who showed up with an Israeli flag. The university used that as a pretext to call in the cops and violently shut down the camp. And, one person said was like, this is all you need to know about America in 2024. I know at Columbia University, there were people on the outside saying provocative things, but they had nothing to do with students. Columbia University is supposed to be open to the public, but they closed off all their entrances, barricaded all their entrances, and so people were demonstrating out front. And you had some both unhinged and unsavory characters, making inflammatory statements about Jews, but at the same time, you had literal Christian fascists show up. One who I know am familiar with from the violent protests in Portland, who made common cause, and he showed up claiming to support Israel and to defend Jews, and yet this guy was using Proud Boys as security in Portland. And Proud Boys, people should recall, was heavily involved in the January 6th insurrection. They were heavily involved. It was one of their members, Jason Kessler, who organized the neo-Nazi Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, where another neo-Nazi murdered Heather Heyer, the anti-racist activist. And yet the media, no one pointed this out. I think a lot of it is just incompetence. But what we see is this really extremist narrative, in support of a genocidal state and genocidal ideology. And I don't think that there's any doubt that that's what Zionism has become at this point, right? All colonial ideologies ultimately are genocidal, because you want to take someone's land, and how do you take their land? They're not just going to be like, oh sure, please come here and take it. No, you have to exterminate them, and to exterminate them, you first have to demonize them, make them seem less than human. And so Israel is just simply become we've seen the mask pulled off since October 7th. It's a genocidal state, and those people who are coming out in support of this war are supporting genocide, whether they say it or not. And yet they're given free rein to actually carry out violence, to commit these heinous acts. I'm not sure if anyone heard, there's all this reporting about, someone yelled, "Go back to Poland" at Jewish protesters. Well, outside Columbia University, these Jewish protesters, Zionists, were yelling, "Go to Gaza" to the students. And yet there's no evidence that it was any student who ever yelled, "Go back to Poland." So, but, I don't want to get too caught up on this, because I think we need to also talk about, these students are incredibly inspiring, and what they're doing is remarkable. And I think people need to appreciate that.
Arun, here in Northern California, and our listening area is in Humboldt and northern Mendocino counties. We know all too well that the way to steal land is to exterminate the indigenous people living on it. That's what happened in the Indian massacres going back 150 years, 125 years. Here in Northern California, you see the same reenactment of that in Gaza. The way to steal their land is for Jewish settlers to kill the indigenous people living there, the Palestinians. So we know that lesson, and we see it reenacted over and over again. I was interested in. You're an excellent investigative reporter, really, really good, and I believe there's a lot of credibility to your reporting. That you have something like false flag attacks. When somebody yells "kill Jews," well, it's probably a Zionist yelling that to discredit the protesters. Um, have you been able to identify Zionist donors and some of the pro-Zionist evangelical groups that may be behind this effort to discredit protesters?
I'm not sure specifically. I haven't been able to identify, but I also haven't, looked into it extensively. I've been reporting on, obviously, that's all been focused on for 6 months is reporting about the war. But most of that is around what I call the Great Israeli Rape Hoax. But I think I have been reporting on protests and also involved in social movements and protests since the late 80s, since the days of the anti-apartheid movement, the divestment movement when I was in college, and the Central America Solidarity movement. So I have a wealth of experience. And one thing I focus on is what I call the social production and reproduction of psychology. And so I think it's just a lot of lone individuals. Clearly there is some funding going on, right? People did identify that the Seinfelds and Bill Ackman was funding these groups in Los Angeles. And if I can explain a little more, just the whole thing, because
Sure.
it's so symbolic of what's going on, that these Zionist groups. So you have this peaceful encampment by students, and people are all outraged. There's this video of some student allegedly being blocked from going into an area of the campus. Well, what people don't know is that a person, I'm not even sure he's a student, is part of this Israeli government operation called Stand With Us. But, I've also covered the extreme right a lot. And in 2016, 2017, when they really just explode, grow in the wake of Donald Trump, they had this strategy where they would try and basically instigate violence and then take a video of it to put up on social media. They wanted to create viral moments of violence because it was a great recruiting tool. And so this is what you see a lot of individuals. I've seen footage of they're grifters of freelance Zionists who are going into camps trying to provoke a confrontation. So there may be money behind some of them, but I think a lot of them, they're just on social media and they're watching what's happening and they're like, hey, I can do this too. I can get fame. I can get money. I can get all these followers. So it creates an ecosystem of grift where then you find people flocking to it for their just own utterly cynical and depraved ends.
Fox News has been making a big deal about Antifa. Last night on the Five and on Jesse Waters' show, they were talking about some of the more violent protesters in the encampments aren't students at all. They're professional demonstrators, professional violent demonstrators. They're Antifa types who are being imported into these encampments. How would you respond to Fox News?
Well, Fox News is just basically it's the America's equivalent of Hutu radio, right? That they're just whipping up these low information and low IQ hordes to a murderous frenzy. Everything Fox News reports is a lie, including and, but, and the. Um,
God, I wish you lived next door, Arun. We would be best bros.
it would be fun. Um, so the thing is, I'll tell you who they're just talking about. Lisa Fithian. I saw her up at City College. She trains activists, right? She helps train them in nonviolent civil disobedience, and she's been doing it for decades. She's a wonderful person. She works with a lot of unions, but and it's just like, so what? Eric Adams, I think, is the mayor of New York. I think is a bigger problem. He was basically using all the language of implying that they're groomers, right? That they're these sinister people out there, influencing young people. And, this is, of course, the whole QAnon narrative. And Eric Adams is completely unhinged. And so he is acting like there are these groomers who are coming in. The Fox News also smeared I forget her name, but the wife of Sami El-Arian, he was this Palestinian who was persecuted by the U.S. government for years, who they kept trying to convict him on terrorism charges, and he won numerous cases and trials, but the government kept persecuting him. So finally, he accepted some charges so he could get out of prison, and he moved to Turkey. I actually had lunch with him last summer in Istanbul. It's just a wonderful, he's a professor in Istanbul, highly educated man. It's Palestinian. And so his wife shows up in support of students at the Columbia University because her daughters live in the U.S. And so she went to Columbia to support the students. She's pictured there kneeling was like, and now you have these headlines like terrorists supporting, infiltrated, student encampments, right? It's just pure propaganda. But let's also, what isn't reported is more important. And what is never reported is how these police departments go to Israel to train. If we want to talk about training, let's talk about how they go to Israel to train, which is which has really the most brutal occupation in the world right now. And they go there and they learn these vicious tactics about how to injure people, about how to hurt people, about how to just cause psychological distress, to terrorize them, and tens, if not hundreds of millions of our dollars, or maybe even more, are being used to send American police forces to Israel to learn these, basically be trained in war crimes and crimes against humanity. Right? Let's talk about that if we want to talk about training. And one final point about this is, I've just been doing back of the envelope calculations. New York City, the actual, not the police department budget, is probably something like 13 billion when you include all the money they hide. Officially it's about 6 billion, but when you include pensions and benefits and the huge amount of settlements they pay every year, which is close to $500 million alone, comes out to $13 billion. That is almost $40 million a day. And the mobilization we've seen has been just so extraordinarily huge. I think conservatively, the New York City police New York City has spent over $100 million on policing. I think around the country, we've seen these massive mobilizations in California, Texas, Georgia, to crush peaceful student protests. I wouldn't doubt if the real number is over $1 billion spent on policing. So let's talk about that, the amount of money used to crush peaceful First Amendment activity.
Yeah, it's even here in little old Mendocino County and Humboldt County, we see military-grade equipment in our sheriff's office, armored cars and such, armored personnel carriers and such. We see helicopters flying over, trying to spot cannabis gardens. We see really the militarization of local law enforcement. Are we moving in the direction of martial law?
I mean, I wouldn't go that far. There's all sorts of varieties of repression. I mean, certainly this is a, form of authoritarian capitalist repression that we're seeing. That's what Trump wanted to institute. And if he gets back into office, maybe he might try and do that. He also wants to call out the U.S. military on its own citizens. But the great political theorist Hannah Arendt once wrote that empire abroad requires repression at home. And so this is symptomatic of any empire. The British repress their population. Certainly Nazi Germany did. France was brutal. There was this infamous mass murder of Algerians by French police in the early 1960s, where they killed hundreds of Algerians who were protesting, murdered them, and threw their bodies into the Seine because they were protesting the brutality of the French war against Algeria that killed 1 million Algerians. Certainly we're seeing this in Israel right now as well, where there's all this repression of dissent. People are being jailed for old social media posts, huge numbers being fired from their jobs, people being threatened. So, I don't want to say that, we're headed towards martial law. I think that's way off. But I think, what you raise, it does involve a very good point, right? Because Biden, they whole campaign strategy, and they've actually now dropped this, was based on two arguments they were going to make. Basically, it's a replay of 2022. Abortion rights and Trump is a threat to democracy, right? And if you notice, they're no longer talking about Trump being a threat to democracy because Biden is a threat to democracy. He and people are like, oh, this is state governments. That's just like, well, you know what? He's got the bully pulpit. He could be saying things. He could say that the DOJ is going to investigate. And he's been, he hasn't been silent, he's been attacking the student protesters as anti-Semitic and just amplifying this propaganda about how intifada is violent, which is ridiculous. Intifada just means uprising or shaking off a colonial oppressor. It is it's a complete inversion. Intifada means resistance to colonial violence. One final point I'll make about that is the colonizer, there is no violence from the colonized without the colonizer, right? All the violence that happens. Now we can say yes, there were some horrible things that happened on October 7th. Hundreds of unarmed civilians were killed. About 770 civilians were killed, 695 Israeli civilians. And I know we're going to talk about this in a minute. Zero evidence of a rape whatsoever on October 7th. That's the two articles I did in The Intercept and Yes Magazine, debunking the Israeli allegations. But there would not be any of this violence without this really 100 years of Zionist colonization. That has been this brutality, this open air prison, 2.3 million Gazans who've been held hostage by Israel and Egypt and the U.S. for 17 years, and there's no discussion about this whatsoever.
We're speaking with Arun Gupta. Arun Gupta. This is Heroes and Patriots.
This is pre-recorded.
Pre-recorded.
On May 2nd.
Right, and we won't be taking phone calls, but it's such a timely topic, don't you think, John? And we could have you on. We could have you on our next 6 shows. Right.
For just on-site, real-time reporting, Arun. Thank you so much for making the time for us. And we will get this interview out to some of the media, national media that that we work with.
Talk about the media that has contacted him.
Yeah,
Since,
yeah. So when you were reporting on the Occupy Wall Street movement, you were deluged with media requests. Are you getting the same type of interest in your reporting now?
No, not at all. I mean, the thing is, these the rape stories. If we are talking about that now, so spent months. Basically, I'm an investigative reporter, and investigative reporters develop a good nose for when something smells rotten. And so when these reports started coming out, and the first reports actually came out hours after the October 7th attack, they all seemed dodgy and dicey.
Reports of the rapes. The rapes.
Reports of rapes, reports that Hamas committed rape on October 7th.
Right.
And so, but it's also, a good investigative reporter always brings a healthy dose of skepticism. And, and you look at everything you can. And so my attitude for a long time was like, look, this attack surprised everyone, even Hamas. Hamas did not think they were going to have this great success. Israel just completely left its, apartheid wall, its prison unguarded because it had moved the IDF units guarding Gaza to the West Bank to accompany this basically what fascistic minister Ben Smotrich. And what I've heard scholars of the Holocaust call these settlers neo-Nazis who were going on these rampages, these pogroms, seizing land, destroying farms, injuring and killing people. And so the IDF units were in the West Bank helping the settlers carry out these pogroms. And so everyone was surprised, right? And so you have this initial force of Hamas that comes in, a couple hundred people, and then they send in a second wave, but then it becomes a free-for-all, and all these civilians, all these other armed groups come in. And, when you have thousands of people coming in, it's just like, I was like, sure, maybe it would be a surprise if there wasn't some sexual assault or even rape that didn't happen. But as time went on, and you can speculate things, but they have to be backed up by evidence.
Right.
And more evidence came out, and it was showing that all these stories are false. A lot of the stories are completely absurd. They became like memes. All these dead baby stories for one, right? Those were every single one was discredited. There was one 10-month-old baby, Mila Cohen, who her mother was holding her in a safe room. A bullet went through the door, and she was shot and killed in her mother's arms. That is the one infant that died. All these stories about 40 dead babies, 20 beheaded babies, burned babies, babies in ovens, dead babies and children hung on clotheslines, completely fabricated. There's one story about a pregnant mother who was murdered, and her fetus was basically carved out of her stomach and was killed in various ways. There's 7 different people who've told a fake version of this story, including 2 Israeli generals. There's, and this was coming from Netanyahu's office, right? And Biden, again, was amplifying this fake propaganda. He said he saw pictures of dead babies. I mean, you have the president of the United States outright lying, engaging in this atrocity propaganda. And so, as I looked into the story, first of all, I started pitching publications, and I'll say it's not a pretty picture out there, and I'm not going to pull any punches. So many of the left media publications that you're aware of, I'm not going to name names, would not run the story. They wouldn't touch it, because they were afraid of being called rape denialists. I had editors at 2 publications who I twisted their arms. They admitted that. Actually, 3 publications, they admitted that. That was, and I would explain to them that was actually central to Israel's strategy, that they were calling anyone who asked for evidence a rape denialist. Israeli officials, these feminists who have just played a really heinous role in promoting this fake rape stories, were even calling UN women's groups, basically some of the most prominent feminists in the world who investigate sexual violence during war, they were calling them rape denialists because they were asking for evidence. And it's just like, you can't just take someone's word for it. And so you had this whole just complete fabrication. And what I did is I looked into all these investigative reports, all these various Israeli civil society reports, and I identified 13 different major reports. And what I started to notice as I was poring over them closely, the same figures keep popping up over and over again. So I made a database, and it turns out there's a dozen individuals who are responsible for the vast majority of the rape claims that you see in the media. Of these 12 individuals, 11 of them are Israeli, come from the Israeli military or police, 11 of the 12. Of the 12, 8 of them have fabricated other atrocity stories, right? So now you're starting to see what's really going on. And Israel doesn't hide anything, right? It has so much impunity. It is in violation of more UN resolutions than the rest of the world combined. And so it thinks it can get away with it, just like, at the beginning of the war, we saw just this complete, just absolutely horrifying incitement to genocide by all the senior Israeli officials, right? By Netanyahu, by the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, by the president, Michael Herzog. They were saying things, don't talk to me about civilians, or, Herzog was like, there's no one innocent there. Yoav Gallant is like, day one, he's just like, we're going to treat them like the human animals they are. We're going to cut off their food, fuel, water, electricity. And then they proceeded to carry this out, and there's been a huge amount of reporting on what Israel has done. There's this publication of Israeli Palestinian journalists called Plus 972. That's a country code for Israel and Palestine, where they have done this excellent reporting showing how Israel is using basically AI to identify targets, but basically anyone's a target. That they have, in the first month of the war, Israel had destroyed more housing than in Gaza, a higher percentage of the housing than the Allies did in 4 years of aerial bombing of Nazi Germany. The devastation is just so enormous. And, we're not hearing much about Gaza anymore because the media really don't care. But Israel has also moved on from a genocide of bombs to then bullets, right? There were all the white flag executions, and that's still going on as well, to now a genocide of a famine that they have created, where people are starving to death and dying of all these communicable diseases. So they have complete impunity. And with the rape story, with the rape claims, it was the same exact story, that the media were just acting as stenographers and repeating just the most absurd claims. And, I probably should have said content warning earlier. I'll try not to get too graphic. So some radio hosts get upset when I start to. I don't go into the really graphic details, but let me give you one example. So one claim that was repeated in every single investigation comes from this anonymous source. First of all, that's a problem that it's anonymous. It's this woman who's only identified as Sapir. She first appears in this police video. It's only a clip. It's 3 minutes long. You can find some portions of this interview with her. Her face is blurred out. The New York Times did interview her. And basically, her story is, so a lot of the alleged rapes, and they're false rapes. I'm not even going to start to, because at this point there has been zero forensic evidence. There's been zero photographic evidence. There's been zero corroborating witnesses. She's claiming she saw 100 militants who were gang raping all these Israeli women. She said there were 5 Israeli women, that they were also beheading others. The claims it sounds like something out of someone's lurid imagination. She's obviously been traumatized, and I think she's being manipulated by the Israeli police. Because even in the clip of the police interview that you see, you can hear the interrogator. He's not so much asking her questions as making suggestions, and then she's agreeing with the suggestions. Right? This is called leading a witness. And she's saying the same thing the interrogator did. Did they rape her standing up? Yes, they raped her standing up. So she's claiming that they're raping women, hacking off breasts, that there's one woman who's being raped, who's being repeatedly stabbed in the back. And I'm like, while she's standing up, and I'm like, how does that even work? You stab someone in the back once, their body's going to fall down. She claims that a militant shoots a woman he's raping while he's still inside her. And it's just like, how does that work also? How do you hold an automatic rifle and shoot someone, and then he finishes while she's dead, right? This is, and these things keep getting repeated, right? You hear these same stories, necro rape, or one of the most common stories, women's with their legs spread. And the Israeli police say they have over 60,000 video and photo files. I spent days searching for and looking, and I looked at, and it was sickening, looking at every single video and photo file I can find online. There's 3 different Israeli government websites, and you can go to my reports in The Intercept and Yes Magazine, where it has all these information and links. And there's no evidence of any of this whatsoever. There's these absurd claims of that at the Supernova Music Festival, the rave, where over half the civilians were killed. I focus on this one group called Zaka. They're ultra-Orthodox Jewish men who collect human remains after mass casualty attacks. Their leaders, officials in the organization, have on video have outright said and boast about inventing stories. They say the bodies are telling a story where we use our imagination. One of the officials is in an Israeli government video. I mean, they don't hide this. He says the walls, the stones screamed rape. It's just like complete fabrication.
So, Arun, we have very little time left. We'll take it at face value as what you say. Many of these rapes, many of these alleged war crimes, were probably fabricated for propaganda purposes because they can't be corroborated. Let's turn the spotlight on Israel. Our friends on Al Jazeera on March the 13th of this year, Simon Speakman Cordell and Veronica Perdosa, reported that there was the United Nations. Let me see if I can get this right. United Nations Relief and Welfare Agency for Palestinians refugees in the Near East have received reports of those very same crimes committed by Israel against Palestinians. Right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I do have a third piece I'm going to publish soon. And I think it's the most important piece because what I say is what Israel has done is create an industrial scale Jim Crow rape hoax. So a lot of the worst massacres during the Jim Crow era, Tulsa, Black Wall Street in 1921, Rosewood, Florida in 1923, the Scottsboro Boys, Emmett Till, on, they began as rape hoaxes.
Yeah.
And so this is precisely what Israel has done. And what it does is it completely inverts the reality of what is going on. And so Israel, and again, Israeli officials outright, like I was talking about how they attacked UN women's groups as rape denialists, they are attacking them because these special rapporteurs, UN special rapporteurs, Francesca Albanese and Rema Al-Aslam, have been highlighting the sexual and gender-based violence that Israel is committing against Palestinian women. And so gender-based violence, what that involves is destruction of healthcare and sanitation. So that means that there's no menstrual health for women and girls who are menstruating. The starvation, there's, I think, something like 100,000 lactating women with infants. So that means their breast milk is drying up. Their infants are at risk of malnutrition and starvation. The complete destruction of the healthcare system means there is no natal care, whether neonatal, or post whatsoever. And so every week, hundreds of Gazan women are having births involving complications. That's all gender-based violence. And also there's other things like there's 3,000 new widows, there's 10,000 orphans. But then there's the sexual, what's considered sexual violence, which includes summary execution of women, murder, and girls. Israeli soldiers are, and this is all documented. Unlike the Israelis, there's only one case of sexual assault, and that involved an Israeli hostage who is in Gaza for nearly 2 months. Her case actually shows why the Israeli claims of rape and sexual violence are false, because that's how sexual violence happens during a war, where you have a captive population. Like what is going on? It doesn't happen in a couple of hours, which is Israel already started counterattacking within 2 hours after Hamas broke through. So in the case of Gaza, Israeli forces have been stripping women naked. They've been humiliating them, degrading them. They've been doing body searches, which is, when someone is naked, that is a form of sexual assault. But the UNRWA, there was an Al Jazeera report about how UNRWA has this report that they have not released, but which Al Jazeera saw and got a hold of, that it was a report of the hostages Israel has taken, right? We never hear about this. Israel has taken thousands of Gazans hostage to Israel where they're tortured. UNRWA interviewed 1,000 who were returned to Gaza, and it's all these accounts of, just severe torture, being traumatized, terrified. And, this is a little graphic. And included accounts of an electric stick being shoved up sexual organs, right? So they're raping Palestinians with a torture device, right? So this,
and again, Arun, we're not talking about, as what Israel is claiming by, professional propagandists, if you will, uncollaborated, unsubstantiated stories, fabricated stories of crimes against women. We're talking here about a report from the United Nations Relief and Works Agencies for Palestinian Refugees. This is a United Nations agency. On our website, we will publish this report. We're not making it up. And this UN agency is not a professional propagandist.
Right.
Instrument.
And so let me say something about the UN real quick, right? Because 2 months ago there was all this hullaboo over that this special envoy Pramila Patten went to Israel and she released this report about sexual violence, and the media completely misreported it. Right, there are a couple of lines where she says there's a reasonable grounds, which is actually a low level of proof in basically. I looked up like the actual UN standards, how they define levels of proof, and she uses a term reasonable grounds to believe that there were multiple cases of rape and sexual violence. But if you read the actual report yourself, what's remarkable about it is she basically says in case after case, it's like not verified or it never happened. And these are so many of the cases that were in that infamous New York Times report of December 28th, Screams Without Words, which I debunked. My reporting was in The Intercept, and I also did a much longer piece in Yes Magazine, in which I showed that that investigation has completely fell apart. In fact, just a few days ago, 50 journalism professors wrote the New York Times saying they need to do an independent investigation of their own reporting because it does not appear credible. And that was just some of the most heinous atrocity propaganda I think that has ever been published. But like I said, it's an inversion. It completely inverts the sexual violence that's going on. And very quickly, this is part of a long historical tendency, right? That in the 1700s colonial America, there was these, one of the most popular forms of fiction was called captivity narratives. And it was all about how white women were being stolen by the natives,
Right.
and that there were also memoirs, right? The memoirs were completely different of actual whites who were taken by Native Americans. In many cases, sometimes they were treated pretty badly, but often they were adopted into these native nations and married and had families, and they would be captured back by the white settlers, and they would run away back to their native families.
Right.
And there's basically no actual documented evidence that natives were raping white women. But in the fictional captivity narratives, they were all about either the women get raped or they commit suicide before they get raped. But it completely inverted what went on because it's the conquistadors, the colonizers who are raping native women. You see the same thing during the slave era, right? Where there's this constant fear of the rebellious, rapacious slaves threatening the purity of white women. But who's doing the rape? It's the slave masters who are raping black women for pleasure, for sadism, and to produce more slaves. Same thing during the Jim Crow era. Then as American empire goes abroad, it brings with it sexual violence and sexual trafficking in the Philippines, in Korea, in Vietnam. During the Iraq War, at one point, there was 50,000 Iraqi women, because the U.S. destroyed Iraqi society. There are 50,000 Iraqi women and girls who were sexually trafficked in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And so what Israel is doing is in this historical vein of inverting the sexual violence. It is the one committing the sexual and gender-based violence, and it's using this basically narrative saying that because the savage hordes of darkies are threatening the purity of white women, we must exterminate the savage hordes of darkies. That's what's really going on.
And as you rightly pointed out, it's more broadly defined than just sexual violence. It's gender violence. When you take away a woman's right to nurse her own baby, or ability to nurse her own baby, when you take away maternity awards where women can deliver babies, when you take away public hygiene and health, that affects the health of women and their babies. This is gender violence across the board, and it's what we're seeing in Gaza right now. Why don't we kind of wrap things up there? Just speak broadly to gender violence.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening is just absolutely horrifying. Anyone who wants to argue with you that this is not genocide, I think is basically one, they're a genocide apologist, and secondly, they're no different than a Holocaust denier. This is one of the most horrifying genocides in human history because it's the first live stream genocide. And I want to actually, if I can, end on a positive note, because going to the camps, these student protest camps, and talking with these students. One of them said they for the last 7 months have been able to open their phones at any point and see this genocide playing out live before them. And they are horrified and they have become radicalized. And I think we may be seeing a process like the Vietnam War, where there's an entire generation who is being radicalized. And because of what's happened, they're going to be radicalized their entire lives. And they have seen at these elite universities just the utter brutality that they're going to be dealt with, that they're being dealt with by the police forces being called in for peaceful protests, that everything is a sham. The liberal democratic state, the international order, human rights, justice, international law. It is all that the state, the American empire and its underlings like Israel have, is brute force in service of a war of extermination. And these kids, they're militant, they're sophisticated, they're learning from the past. They want it. Like I've seen other social movements like Occupy Wall Street where no one wanted to learn from the past. They just wanted to reinvent the wheel. These kids do not want to reinvent the wheel. They want to learn. They're learning from the anti-apartheid divestment movement, which also did occupations and built shanty towns on college campuses. That's how I got mine started in the late 80s, building a shanty at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where I went to college, and I'm still at it 35 years later. And so these kids are I hate, I have hope in the next generation, because of course we were all once that generation, right? But still, it's they are really being radicalized. They have been born into a world of horrors. Remember, this generation, if you're 22 years old, you were born right after 9/11. Right. And so all you've ever known is horrors, 9/11, the Iraq War, the Great Recession, and positive moments that are also tied to horrors, right? The Black Lives Matter birth at Ferguson in 2014, but then the rise of the fascist right. There's a climate chaos, the climate justice movement, low-wage workers movement, the resurgence of socialism and militant labor organizing, the pandemic. And so they have always been in just this world of horrors and chaos. And even if they thought that they could, okay, maybe I can do some good by, taking a job in government or some institution, the last 6 months has really opened their eyes and radicalized them. And Francis Fox Piven, the great social theorist, said to me in 2011, I think Occupy is the beginning of a great social movement. And a lot of these kids look to Occupy, even though it was problematic. One of them told me, you guys are legends to us. And so we are seeing the continuation of this movement. And I think this in many ways is like Occupy 2.0. And we're going to see just really positive reverberations for a long time to come in terms of these kids trying to make a better, more humane world against this vicious, absolutely barbaric ruling class who lords over us.
Arun, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left, and the key thing here seems to be getting accurate information and protesting with accurate information. Do you feel that these students, administrators, and so forth are protesting with the accurate information, or are they getting propaganda from various resources?
Well, so, going, because doxing, death threats is such a huge problem, right? And this is a point I was trying to get at earlier. Is this whole narrative of safety? It completely ignores that these administrations have actually been putting their students at risk who oppose the genocide since October 7th. And they've been doing, it's not just doing nothing to protect them. They've been punishing them. They've been complicit in the doxing of them. They have been, attacking them when they are attacked by others. That happened on Columbia, where two individuals who are allegedly with the IDF attacked students with some chemical. This is back in the fall. Attacked students with what appeared to be like some chemical weapon, like a pepper spray, which is a chemical weapon under the Geneva Conventions. And the administration response was to issue a press release attacking the students. And it's only later when, the students made an outcry that the administration finally grudgingly said something. But these students, they don't listen to the mainstream media. When I would go around, and I'm a freelancer, I'd mention places I wrote for. I'd say The Intercept, Jacobin, The Nation. I often wouldn't get a lot of response, and they look at me suspiciously. And I'd mention, and what really made everyone's eyes light up was when I said Al Jazeera.